Coast FM's Celebrity Science, bringing you interviews with scientists, celebrities, and special guests. Well, a very good evening to you. Thank you very much for joining me, Ben Makin, here on Coast FM for tonight's episode of Celebrity Science, the show that brings you interviews with scientists, very special guests, and some cheeky celebs as well. Now then, what have we got on the show for you this evening? Well, we have got a very exciting one, and those of you who saw my little Facebook Live video a second ago, I must apologise, I've gone a bit insane, because I'm very excited, because our first guest for this evening is the one and only Professor Deborah Gordon from Stanford University. Now, I'm just going to say this one phrase, and you are going to be excited. So what does she research? Well, how about this? Ants in space. Yes, ants. Just hang on a minute. Ants in space. Isn't that the coolest thing? Okay, well, she sent a bunch of ants, an ant colony, to the International Space Station to conduct some cutting-edge research into behavioural science. This is just one of the experiments she's been involved with. She talks a lot about the collective behaviour that you can see in colonies. Some of this is amazing. It blew my mind chatting to Deborah, actually. Some of these ideas even apply to technology. There's a term that you're going to come across that I bet you haven't heard before. The Antinet. Yeah, the Antinet. That's how do ants and the study of ants, how does that actually apply to the internet? Well, it applies to other areas of technology as well, potentially robotics as well. How can we apply ant algorithms, so-called ant algorithms, to help us in these different areas of technology? Professor Deborah Gordon is your lady there. She is fantastic. She's also, you'll be pleased to know, a massive fan of Ant-Man from the Avengers, obviously. Now, there's just one actual niggling little thing that she had with that, though. More on that a bit later. There's just one tiny problem with Ant-Man. She will reveal that as well. There's also a couple of citizen science projects that she's running at the moment. You can get involved in these. So if you want to run your own ant experiments, or perhaps if you know a teacher, or if you yourself are a teacher, this could be a great thing for your class. You can actually run your own ant experiments with ants that you can find out in the garden, and you can contribute to Professor Deborah Gordon's projects and actually help science. So that would be pretty awesome. We've got some of the scientists as well lined up for you this evening. I'm going to delve back into some interviews with very, very special guests indeed. First up, Dr. Charlie Cornwallis from Lund University in Sweden. He's talking about these major evolutionary transitions, now stay with me here, major transitions that shaped the development of life on Earth. So yes, we're thinking big. Yes, we're going to get philosophical. It's going to be awesome. We talk about, for example, the progression to multicellularity and complex life. We talk about the benefits of sexual reproduction and of group living. All of these things, I should say, quite mysterious to the biologist. Or are they? Is he going to explain all? Well, we shall see. Charlie is on the show this evening. Now, if that isn't your cup of tea in science, we've got even more science for you. Professor Fiona Jordan from Bristol University, she's an anthropologist interested in the evolution of language. And in particular today, she's going to be talking about the evolution of human kinship systems and the language associated with that. So we're covering a bunch of different areas in science today, aren't we, folks? Now, of course, we've got some of the very special guests as well. I am now going to reveal our mystery guest for this evening. He's going to pop on the show briefly to give you just a bit of an inspirational message. This guy became an entrepreneur at 15 years old. He's going to pop on the show, recommend some music, because music is his thing. This is Jamal Edwards, MBE, the founder of SBTV. If you don't know what SBTV is, then actually you can credit SBTV for discovering Ed Sheeran. It's a music platform that he basically gets a bunch of different musicians on. And yeah, they got Ed Sheeran on there before he reached, before he gained worldwide fame. So pretty cool stuff. So Jamal Edwards, MBE, is on the show this evening with a little message for us. Now, I also want to play a very, very, very little quick message from Libby Jackson. We've had Libby on the show before. I'm not going to play the full interview. If you'd like to catch the full interview, certainly can do that. Pop on the Facebook. Oh, look at me. You've got cheeky links everywhere, left, right, and centre. Anyway, pop on my Facebook page. You'll find it there if you want to. Because, you know, we're talking about the International Space Station with Deborah Gordon. Ants in the ISS. Come on, that's the coolest thing ever. But I thought maybe it's about time I reminded you about a particular fact about astronauts, human astronauts, going to the ISS. It's pretty cool. It's about music. So I thought, quite fitting, isn't it, really, for a radio show? Now, we also have Dee Kafari MBE on the show this evening. She's a British sailor. Just a bit of background on Dee, because she's seriously impressive. Well, in 2006, she became the first woman to sail single-handedly and non-stop around the world the wrong way. That means against the prevailing winds and currents. In 2009, she set a new record because apparently that wasn't enough. She became then the first woman to sail solo non-stop around the world in both directions. And most recently, actually, in 2017, she skippered the Turn the Tide on plastic boat in the 2017-18 Volvic Ocean Race. So, of course, that had a fantastic scientific message for everybody. And, of course, everyone now is very familiar with the idea that plastic waste is something that must be addressed. We've touched on that a bunch of times on the show previously, so I won't delve into that tonight. But it's always potential for that to happen on a future show. Now then, before I go any further, I'm afraid it happened, folks. That's something I've got to do. Professor Sasha Dahl, one of our show regulars. Yes, the fantastic Prof. Dahl. We love Sasha, but unfortunately, he insisted tonight on a particular song choice before I actually kick off the show. He said if I don't play this, then maybe he'll never come on the show ever again. So, of course, we do want him back, so I'm just going to go ahead and play this. And, guys, I'm sorry. If you're not a fan of the Beebs, you just got to accept it, because Sasha is. This one goes out to you, Sasha. Enjoy, baby. Anyway, just before we go and join our very, very first guest for this evening, which, of course, is the fantastic Professor Deborah Gordon from Stanford, I told you I was going to remind you about this little fact, because, of course, we're about to visit the ants in space in the ISS. Well, it's about time, I think, that I remind you about this. Libby Jackson, she was actually Tim Peake's Principia Outreach Manager, which is pretty cool, and she's Human Spaceflight Director. Real-life Human Spaceflight Director, that's really cool, isn't it? So Libby actually confirmed this is indeed true. Let me just show you this. Just you wait there. This is a fact that I've learned off the great Wikipedia, so this might not be true, but I really want to know, is it true that each astronaut is allowed 3 songs to be played to them before their mission?
When they are waiting on top of the Soyuz rocket, so when Tim was in his capsule, the Russians do pipe music through. There's no countdown or anything like that. They get to choose different songs, and I think one of Tim's choices was Queen and Don't Stop Me Now. So yeah, they really do get to choose the music. Brilliant.
You know what? I might have to get one of those on the show actually, just to kind of accompany your appearance in honor of you coming on the show today, Libby.
Oh, thank you very much. It'd be great.
Cool stuff, right? So, hey, I tell you what, let's be a bit like Tim Peake. Imagine we're about to ascend to the ISS in our Soyuz Ascent module, and we're playing a bit of Queen. We're going to go and check out the ants in the ISS with Deborah Gordon. Off we go!
Eastern Green, Grumbler, Holestown,
West Cornwall's Coast FM, your local Coast
FM. Okay, folks, it's time for this interview with the fantastic Professor Deborah Gordon. Here she is.
I'm Deborah Gordon. I'm a professor of biology at Stanford, and I work on collective behavior, especially in ants, which are a great example of collective behavior because they work without central control.
Thank you very much, Deborah. Now, of course, I am going to be coming on to the excellent topic that's ants in space, because that's fantastic. But first of all, I wonder if we could begin to think about this, and just to kind of illustrate it for our listeners and come to the basics, I suppose, to start with, and just talk a little bit about what we kind of mean in terms of collective behaviour in ants, the kind of things we can observe them doing, because they're fascinating, aren't they? And I hadn't quite realised just how remarkable they are, reading some of your work and what they're capable of, with such simple rules. But I'm going to let you kind of jump in and just talk a little bit about that, if that's okay.
Collective behavior is very widespread in nature. Brains work without central control. Inside our bodies, tissues work without central control. But ants are a great example because you can see everything that they're doing. So when I say they work without central control, I mean that there's no leader, there's nobody in charge. An ant colony consists of one or more reproductive females, and although we call them the queens, they don't tell anybody what to do, they don't have any authority, they don't give directions. In fact, no ant gives directions to another. All the ants that you see walking around are sterile female workers, and they respond to very simple interactions with each other. And in the aggregate, when you add those up, you get the amazing collective accomplishments of the colony.
I saw it in one of your TED Talks, actually, which I do recommend to our listeners to get a nice insight into your work. it is kind of essentially this picture that you put together with all the not very good at explaining this, I'm afraid, but the network, the end result of all these kind of simple movements and things, and it looks absurdly complicated, the end result, and you think, wow, that's just simply the result of the ants moving around, interacting with one another.
Yes, most ants can't see, and they operate by smell, and they smell with their antennae. So when one ant touches another, it smells the other ant. And they use a layer of grease spread on their bodies that has a smell. That's how one ant assesses if another ant is a nestmate or what job it's been doing. And each ant uses just the rate at which it smells other ants to decide what to do. So when you add up all of the ants contacting each other, smelling each other, that makes a network. Another kind of network that's more familiar to people, maybe who have had ants in their kitchen, is when one ant puts down a chemical on the ground and another ant comes along and smells it. So that is an interaction with a lag. So one ant is smelling the chemical left by the other ant.
And there's a bunch of really fascinating potential just uses of this in industry and in all kinds of different areas as well, isn't there? Because I know you were talking a bit about this again in your TED talk, which I really enjoyed listening to. And there's a great term actually you used, the Antonet. Absolutely love that. what a great word. I wonder if you can explain what's going on there. So you're essentially taking some of these ideas and saying, hey, hang on, these might be really useful in technology and things like this.
The Antonet is a way of thinking about how one kind of ant regulates how many ants go out to forage. And it's very similar to the way on the internet we regulate how data flows. So these ants, harvester ants, use the rate of interaction to decide whether to forage. An ant that's going out to look for food doesn't leave unless it gets enough contacts, enough opportunities to smell ants coming in with food. In the same way, when you press the key to send an email message, the data go out in packets. And the way that it works is that each packet doesn't leave your computer until it meets enough acknowledgments from the router saying that the previous packets had the bandwidth to go on. So it's the same kind of regulation through positive feedback, both in TCP/IP, which is the protocol that regulates bandwidth on the internet, and how these ants regulate foraging. So we called it Antonet because they're using the same kind of process. And of course, those are not the only two places where feedback from simple interactions can regulate the flow of work.
And you were kind of putting forward some ideas about how you might be able to apply some of these kind of ant algorithms in things like robotics, because of course, I guess listeners are really used to the idea that, we send out these incredible probes and they might collect a bunch of data and they're fantastic, but actually what if we, and this is one of your points, what if we had a lot of kind of cheaper probes, essentially, if you like, that interact with one another in a simple manner, simple data, but the end result could be fantastic.
Yes, that's a really important lesson that people in robotics are picking up from nature, that often it's easier and cheaper to have many actors, say many robots, each of which doesn't have a way to assess the global task, but together they can accomplish some task. And one obvious one is searching. So for searching, for collective search, there's a trade-off between how thoroughly you search and how much ground you cover. So if you have enough robots or ants or any other kind of searchers, then if there are more of them, they can afford to be more thorough. And it might be worth it to have many cheap robots, each searching pretty thoroughly in a local way, that merely communicate with each other, not with some central control. If you lose a few, if they're cheap enough, it doesn't matter. That's the way that ants work, and that's the way we could work with robots as well.
Fantastic. Well, thanks, Deborah. I wonder if we could come on to this ants in space topic now, because I know there's, and I don't know whether this is still an ongoing thing, so great to ask you about this actually, but the way that people can get involved with this, because I know you were kind of doing some citizen science in this area as well, as part of this project, where people can get involved and try out some experiments themselves. I don't know if you're still looking for people to do that, and if so, you could talk about that a bit for us.
Yes, on our lab website there is an Ants in Space page, and it has some simple instructions for people to try to learn about how their local ants do collective search. So the basic question is, how do ants change the way that they search depending on how many ants there are around? If there are enough ants, each ant can afford to be more thorough because there will be an ant nearby searching. But if there are a few ants in a large space, then the ants, to cover ground, need to stretch out their paths to cover more ground. So we did this experiment in the International Space Station, asking how ants might adjust the way that they search to density in conditions without gravity. In fact, they had a pretty hard time searching without gravity.
Yes.
So it's not really fair to ask them to be good at that, since evolution has not really shaped ants to deal very well with the absence of gravity. But it was an opportunity to see how they do it. And it made me realize that, of course, we know so little about how ants on Earth search collectively, and that we might be able to learn a lot if people would try this very simple experiment with their local species of ants. And so there is a way on the website with very cheap materials to try this experiment, to enter the data, and we're hoping to put those data together to compare species. There are more than 14,000 species of ants, and maybe only 50 of them have ever been studied. So almost anything that you do to learn about ants will be for the first time.
Oh, that's fantastic. I'm thinking as well that would be absolutely ideal if any science teachers happen to listen into this. What a fantastic thing they could get their class doing or something like that. Fantastic.
That's right. That's right. I think that it would be great for a class. In England, there are, I think, only 7 or 8 species of ants, but even those 8 species of ants, believe it or not, have not been thoroughly studied. So there's lots of opportunities to learn about ants right around here.
Fantastic. You know, I've just thought of another term as well, because obviously ant astronauts. What about antronauts?
That's right, yes.
Not quite as good as the astronauts.
Yeah.
Nowhere near as good. But.
Well, the astronauts really liked, the human astronauts really enjoyed doing this experiment because it was pretty interesting, and they reported back that they had a really good time working with the ants on the internet, on the ISS.
Fantastic. I bet you got some really cool photos as well of the astronauts playing around with them and things.
Yes.
Great.
And the tapes are great too. You hear them talking about it, like, look at that one over there. And,
bet they named them and everything. They would have done, weren't they?
Well, there were maybe too many of them for that.
Yeah. Number 1, number 2, number 3, so on.
I have another citizen science project going that might be interesting for any teachers that are listening.
Please.
It's called Land Talk. So the website is www.landtalk.org, LANDTALK, Land Talk. And it records interviews between a younger person and an older person about changes that they have seen. We are all living in a time of very rapid change, and due to change in the climate and other reasons. And we've realized that often older people who have been in the same place for at least 20 years have noticed a lot in just the observations of everyday people. And we are trying to create an opportunity to record those observations. And we find that when students go out and talk to their parents and grandparents about changes that they've seen, that the younger people, the kids or the college students, realize that there has really been rapid enough change for people they know to have noticed it. So we'd love to have more entries from this part of the world, so that would be great.
Oh, fantastic. Well,
Land Talk.
It's always fantastic to hear about ways that people, and everybody can get involved with science. I think that's such a wonderful thing for people to realise, because I think science, I guess especially traditionally, almost seems like this thing that's quite inaccessible to people that they can't get involved with, but actually projects like that are proof that no, science is for everybody.
Yes, well, climate change is a topic that perhaps more in the US, I'm not sure about that, but where it was represented as something that only a lot of obscure calculations could demonstrate. But ordinary people every day see the effects of climate change, and those observations are just as valid as the ones that scientists make. And so we would like to put those observations together and make them available to everyone.
Fantastic. Well, Deborah, thank you very much indeed for your time so far. And I wonder if, at this point, I'd like to and obviously you might not have these this to hand, in which case if you supply us with it, it'd be fantastic. But any websites, links, Twitter handles, or anything like that you'd like to point our listeners to, that'd be fantastic, and we could maybe put those on our Facebook page and things for people to have a look at.
That would be great.
So that'd be awesome. And finally, and this is a very key question, and this is a bit of a harsh one, and usually, I don't know, I sometimes feel bad about this, but how about a song request? Have you got a favourite song that I could play for you today? This is a bit mean to be putting you on the spot, isn't it? I think you've earned it, so if you can kind of think of I don't know, you can have some time and get back to me on that if you like, but if you can think of a theme tune or something for yourself, then that's going to come on. Okay.
I'll try and think of something related to ants.
Yeah. It's like the Ant-Man theme tune, isn't it?
That's right. Yes, I don't know what the Ant-Man theme tune is. I loved Ant-Man. I thought it was really great. I
was going to say, for yourself, I bet that's just fantastic.
Yeah.
Any kids who are into Ant-Man, right, they can get involved with actual ant science.
Yes.
Through your citizen projects. That's fantastic.
I once was asked to speak at Marvel Studios, and I have a picture of me standing next to the Ant-Man mask. We both looking a little green, so it's of course a cherished photo.
I was really hoping you were going to be a fan, but I didn't want to assume.
Well, do you remember the scientist? I've forgotten the name of the scientist in the movie. Hank Pym, who has this wonderful little device he puts behind his ear, and then he can talk to the ants, and they listen to him. Well, I'd love to have one of those. It'd be really handy. You should
develop one. That'd be fantastic.
Yeah, it'd be great.
You'd have to rely on these kind of simple cues, though, right? You'd have to go up and kind of, I don't know, touch the ant with some antennae. You could have some robotic antennae or something. There could be something you can do, surely.
Yeah, well, his was very easy for carrying out into the field.
Wasn't it?
Yeah, of course the ants never listened to me. The only thing I minded about Ant-Man is that Ant-Man was riding around on a queen, and he kept calling it Anthony. It should have been Antonia. But that was a small problem. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Deborah.
Oh, did you hear that? Did you hear that? What a blunder have Marvel made with that one. Anyway, that was the fantastic Professor Deborah Gordon. Thanks so much again, Deborah, for coming on the show this evening. Pleasure chatting to you all about those fascinating projects, in particular, of course, the Ants in Space project. Now, there is a way, of course, that you can get involved and do some of your own ant experiments, if that's of any interest to you at all. And it might be particularly good as well for any teachers out there. So just check that out, Ants in Space. Just Google Ants in Space, Deborah Gordon. Stanford University, you'll find it. And that second citizen science project she was talking about also will be ideal for teachers. I've noticed that it has lesson plans and everything on there, actually. And that was landtalk.org. Landtalk.org. So you can check that one out as well. But of course, I think it's time to get the Ant-Man theme tune on now, don't you think? There we have it. Okay, moving on with the show then. Our next guest, as promised, it's Dee Kafari, MBE, the first of two guests tonight with an MBE, actually, as it so happens, which is pretty cool stuff. Dee Kafari, of course, is best known for setting a record to become the first woman to sail solo non-stop around the world in both directions. Fantastic stuff. So, well, you know, if you're chatting to Dee, you've got to chat about one thing, and obviously that's going to be sailing, isn't it? But don't worry, we also managed to touch on music because this is a radio show and I wanted a song request, basically. So I managed to wangle it in. Here we go. Hey, Dee, can you hear me okay?
I can, Ben. Nice to speak to you.
Oh, very nice to speak to you. Well, thanks very much for agreeing to do this. It's absolutely fantastic to have you with us on the show.
Oh, cool.
Also, Dee, I'm going to warn you, because, you know, I'm going to have to warn you. I just feel in a kind mood today. I tend to spring song choices on people, but I think I'm going to warn you about that, okay? So at the end of the interview, if you've got an idea about a theme tune, especially if it's a cool theme tune that people can imagine you sailing to, then maybe we should play it on the show. Is that all right?
Okay, no worries.
Okay, awesome. Well, let's get chatting about sailing, Dee, because of course you're the perfect person to talk to with you know, all these numerous records and things. Absolutely fantastic. So congratulations for your MBE as well. Thoroughly well deserved.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I've crammed a lot of sailing into a very short space of time.
Yes, fantastic. And I guess just to start and get this across to our listeners, what is it about sailing that kind of captivated you? Because it clearly has. Because I mean, given all your achievements, clearly it's something that was really close to your heart.
It is, and I love it just for that feeling of freedom, that ability to harness the power of nature and make it all work together. And it isn't something that you have to do from a young age. I was a school teacher and changed careers after 5 years of teaching. I came into sailing relatively late, which is why I laugh and say I just crammed a lot in a short space of time.
Yes.
That ability to travel and have adventure and to see land and life from a different perspective.
Strategy for that clearly worked. Cramming a lot in a short space of time, Dee, clearly worked very well, didn't it?
It did. I've been very lucky, very fortunate, and I've really grabbed the opportunities as they've arisen.
Now, Dee, just so people could imagine this, because I think to the average person this sounds... Well, I'm just going to take one of your achievements, of course, the sailing around the world in the wrong direction, so-called, because against the currents, I believe. But how long does it take to do something like that? Because it sounds impossible, I think, to the layman.
Well, there's definitely a reason only 5 people ever have sailed what's considered the wrong way around the world. It is quite frustrating because you spend a lot of time sailing in the wrong direction. And that took me 6 months. So 6 months on a boat on my own with no external impact. And I came back relatively sane, I thought.
Yeah. Well, please tell me you at least had an MP3 player or something, because obviously this is where your theme tune comes in, right? You must have had some epic theme tune all the way. Please tell me.
Well, my karaoke skills are unbelievably amazing, so long as I'm offshore on my own on a boat.
Yes.
But it's a very eclectic mix of music, because it depends on where I am geographically and what the weather's like.
Yeah. It's a shame you can't kind of stop off for a bit of tapas in Spain and all that kind of thing, isn't it, really? Just pop off for a bit, get something in.
Well, the only times I considered stopping off was to go and have a good bath and have a little rest. But I always wanted to get back on. I never wanted to give up.
You know what, Dee? It's perfect for us down here in Cornwall because, of course, we are all massive fans of the sea down here in Cornwall. So why not pop on the sea, you know?
Definitely. You've got a beautiful coastline, stunning seafood and restaurants. Lots of bays to visit. I mean, I'm a big fan of your coastline down there and sailing in your area.
Fantastic. Well, thanks, Dee. I was going to say, actually, because you were mentioning the coastlines, there is an epic coastline, and I really advise you to sail around there, because I think, and I'd love to just see you sailing past. It would be really cool. It's a beach called Pedden Vounder. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. It's a bit of a secret one. It's next to Porthcurno, which is where the Minack Theatre is. So it's nearby a well-known beach. Check it out, down at Land's End. That's my tip for you. If you haven't been there already, you might
well, I'm so used to just sailing straight past, so I will grab an opportunity one day when I get to meander in the bays and have an explore of your area.
Yes, that's it. Do it. Now, Dee, just a few minutes left, and I will let you go, I promise. But I'd love really now to, it has come to the dreaded time. I'm going to have to ask for a song choice. Now, you said your taste was a bit eclectic. That's fine. Maybe you can choose 2. How about that? Can you narrow down it to 2?
Okay, well, I think that's a tough call, but I reckon that, the classic, the ultimate tune that people can imagine sailing off over the horizon to is Rod Stewart Sailing.
Oh, well, of course it is. Yeah, I love Rod. He's the greatest.
The cliche, isn't it, really? And then I think we need to kind of, build it up a little bit and have a little bit of fun and have a little bit of Imagine Dragons, because just recently I did the Volvo Around the World race, and that was one of our main songs for arrival and departure.
Oh, awesome. Yeah, 2 absolutely cracking choices. I'm going to get them both on, Dee, in honour of your appearance on the show. How's that?
That's great. I'm very proud of that. Thank you very much.
No worries. Well, thanks so much. It's been an absolute pleasure having the show. And thanks for all your time today. And I'm looking forward to playing those tunes as well, I can tell you.
Oh, awesome. Thanks a lot. Nice to talk to you.
Cheers, Dee. Thanks. Bye now.
Bye.
Coast FM.
Welcome back, folks. It's me, Ben Makin, still in the studio here at Coast FM Towers. Oh, yes, I'm in the studio. It's a lot of fun this evening. I'm having a lot of fun. I hope you are as well. Anyway, coming up next, it's our very special guest, Dr. Charlie Cornwallis from Lund University. Now, Charlie's going to be touching on some pretty big topics tonight, so prepare yourself. Sit down. You're a dusty scholar now, so, pop yourself into a nice armchair. Get yourself a nice, refreshing cup of tea or something, and let's listen close. Very, very warm welcome to you. Thanks very much for agreeing to do this. Absolute pleasure to have you on the show with us.
It's great to be here.
As we were just saying, really, I mean, your area of science is just so obviously interesting, so I think I'm really keen for our listeners to hear about this. I'm not going to explain this, though. I'm going to let you jump straight in there, if that's all right, Charlie, and talk a little bit about your kind of primary focus in your research group. And I'd love as well to point our listeners in the direction of websites and things at the end as well, so that listeners can hopefully follow your science and get involved, and any Twitter handles like that or anything like that. Love to get those from you as well. And I'm going to give you a warning as well, Charlie, because I always like to give my guests a song request as well. Now, I've been kind to you, because most people I leave that to the end, and then it's a bit of a shock. So if I warn you now...
I've got to be thinking about it now.
Yeah, although it might make you a bit stressed now. But that's
I know. God, I'm not going to be able to talk about science. Just what's my favourite song?
And if you don't choose, it'll be Rod Stewart, by the way.
Okay.
I should warn you.
Charlie specifically wanted.
Yeah.
Anyway, let's get started with some of your science, Charlie. I see you started out actually in Sheffield, which I was pleased to see, because one of my very good friends, Callum, came from Sheffield. He did his undergrad there.
Yeah.
And then, of course, moved on, and now in your lab group, really focusing on major evolutionary transitions. And I know you do a bunch of things all kind of relating to that, and your seminar later, I'm really looking forward to catching that as well. I guess I'll just let you kind of explain in your own words, though, what your kind of research focus is in your lab group.
Yeah, I started off working in Sheffield, and there I was interested in things like why do certain individuals choose mates with certain characteristics, how when individuals are competing over mates, does one win and one lose, what are the reasons for that, was what I started off being interested in. And then this got very experimental and quite specific focus, and I had a time where I thought I wanted to broaden out, and I was really started off being motivated by biology because of the natural diversity around us, and I had this kind of realisation that I had lost that a little bit and gone a bit too specific. So started thinking about ways in which we can study how complex life had evolved on Earth, and at that time come across this book, The Major Transitions in Evolution, and that book it's got this really nice framework whereby it says life on Earth has arisen by these different transitions. So, for example, genes have joined together to form genomes, the eukaryotic cell, which is obviously really important for producing all the energy within our bodies, that was formed through the partnership between different cells, and also multicellular organisms were the product of partnerships between unicellular or single cells. And I grew up as a bird watcher, and one of the things that you notice in the backyard is things like long-tailed tits that at this time of year are all huddling together, just like people are working together. And so why have certain species form these societies where they cooperate? So all these different levels of life, you've got this kind of unifying process of individuals forming these partnerships to form more complex organisations that have certain advantages, like dividing labour or the economies of scale and these type of things. So in our research group at the moment, we're trying to explain these different transitions, so multicellularity being one, cooperative societies being another. We also look at symbioses, so partnerships between different species that enable them to kind of solve ecological problems. So we have these different projects running that are unified by the kind of same principle.
Fantastic. I mean, it sounds like an absolutely brilliant group that you run. Lots of really interesting science, and I do urge our listeners to go and check it out actually and see all the various different projects running. But I think if we could just kind of go through some particular things that you've just mentioned there, especially so I think multicellularity is one of those things which everyone will just immediately find fascinating, because of course if you think about it, and I kind of often do think about this, pretty much everything that we care about that isn't bacteria or archaea obviously is multicellular, right? Everything is
even bacteria can be multicellular. You
can tell us more about that, I'm sure. But I mean, I think it's just so obviously important, isn't it? Figuring out, why these transitions occur. Also, I know that one of your kind of focuses has been how complexity is maintained, because of course you establish this condition where you have like a complex system from a simpler starting point. How is that maintained? And I suppose going along that line as well is this kind of idea in natural selection, of course, that it doesn't necessarily favour complexity, obviously. Complexity is just a byproduct of what's going on. But in terms of the multicellularity aspect of that, I mean, is this something which is kind of grabs your attention as well? I mean, you mentioned bacteria, though, can also do this multicellularity. Do we have any kind of leading ideas about how this actually occurred, this multicellularity?
Yeah, I mean, it's so there's a lot of fantastic work going on in this area, and as you say, it's I think something that's naturally interesting, because all around us we've got these complex multicellular organisms, and how have they come from what people think of this primordial soup? And so a lot of the work that's been done in this field is trying to explain those steps. And I mean, one thing that's quite striking is that obligate multicellularity, that's you can only live in a multicellular group, has arisen only a few times. It's quite rare. Something's quite special about it. And so this has really been what's driving people's interest. The problem, I think, is that all around these kind of complex multicellular organisms, we have things that are unicellular, they're living on their own, and they're being just as successful. And this really challenges this idea that complexity in itself is favoured by natural selection. If that was the case, we wouldn't see the persistence of these simple life forms. And so at the moment, a lot of our research is focusing on actually what are the ways in which single-cellular organisms cope with the same selection pressures that multicellular organisms have when they started becoming multicellular. And I used to think, multicellularity, it first arose billions of years ago on Earth and so can't be studied. But actually, things joining multicellular groups is happening all around us. So algae in ponds, bacteria, they form multicellular groups to resist antibiotics, for example. These are processes that are going on all around us, so we can actually study this and ask, okay, what are the selective pressures, or what are the forces that are driving this group formation? And once we've characterised those, then we can say, well, how are these unicellular organisms able to cope with those same pressures? And maybe that helps us explain why on some branches of the tree of life we've got these amazing elaborate organisms, whereas in other branches of the tree of life they've remained relatively simple. And there are various things that group formation seems to allow organisms to cope with. So being eaten by predators seems really important for things like algae. Being in a group just gives you that protection against being eaten. There's also nutrient acquisition. Things like yeast are able to acquire nutrients by being in these multicellular groups. So there are these certain kind of basic requirements. Don't get eaten, acquire food, disperse to new areas that being in a multicellular group can help with. But of course, that's only one solution, and there are many defences that a single cell can have against being eaten, different ways they can acquire food and these type of things. So we are characterising the pressures that are favouring group formation, multicellular group formation, and then asking how other organisms coping with that.
Fantastic. I hadn't thought of the fact that you could find, for example, free living bacteria or whatever, and then watch them form groups and things and compare. Thank you for that. Absolutely fantastic. Because there's another kind of related area that I was really hoping to touch on as well, if that's okay with you, and of course that's sexual reproduction, because there's another one of these kind of main focuses of your research group. And I think that's really interesting because again, it's kind of one of those things that people might think of in terms of, okay, why exactly did that happen? All familiar with kind of bacteria just dividing asexually. Why do we need this kind of sexual reproduction, and why is it kind of maintained? I don't know if you've got any kind of obvious thoughts on that for our listeners.
I think one of the go-to explanations for that is that if you reproduce asexually, then that's great because you're essentially cloning yourself. So all the genes that you have are replicated, and that's the basis of natural selection, is promoting those gene copies. So asexual reproduction obviously makes a lot of sense. But if you're facing many different pressures, the fact that you have limited genetic variation means that you might not be able to adapt, or adaptations will be less likely to arise that allow you to cope with those changing environments. And one way of getting around that is obviously to sexually reproduce. So then you're shuffling up the genetic cards, and that can lead to more beneficial gene combinations that allow you to cope with difficult ecological problems. So that's fine, and a lot of organisms obviously do sexually reproduce, but a lot of them reproduce sexually sometimes and asexually others, and that would seem like a winning strategy. So when times are tough, you reproduce sexually, and that allows you to produce offspring that can cope with those turbulent environments. But when things are stable, you go down the selfish route and just have asexual reproduction. So I think the really difficult thing to explain is why you'd be obligately sexually reproducing, and for that there's lots of good theoretical work that I think is starting to tackle this problem. But again, just like multicellularity, the distinction between being obligate and facultative is a really key one here, and why would you ever give up the right to do two things like facultative things do and commit to one particular lifestyle? And I think that's an area of active research. And
fantastic. Well, this is all sounding absolutely fascinating, Charlie. Thanks for this so far. I'd really like, if it's okay with you now, to kind of come back to the symbiosis point that we were mentioning at the beginning. And I know you kind of touched on this already as well, but because I think it's really fascinating for listeners to think about, how you can directly kind of think about that in terms of our own bodies, because of course we have symbiotic bacteria, but deeper than that, and this comes back to your kind of work on multicellularity and these kind of ideas that we've already been getting across today. But in terms of, I just think it's remarkable whenever you think about, well, all of my cells are only powered because of some ancient symbiosis, presumably between a pre-existing cell and the bacterial symbionts that then became the mitochondria. And I just think it's quite almost a humbling thing to think about, that actually your cells right now, you're only alive because of these symbiosis, because of this these mutualisms between different interacting partners. So I think the importance and interest of thinking about things in terms of the kind of grand scale of interacting partners producing complexity, I think that's just a fascinating point to start in biology.
Yeah, absolutely. I think all these partnerships and how they've been set up and what they've enabled organisms to do is fascinating. And I mean, you mentioned the bacteria within our bodies. Actually, there are more bacterial genes than human genes in the listeners at the moment. So you're more bacteria than human. I think I grew up with the notion that bacteria were a bad thing. They're the cause of illnesses, but I think there's a real sea change now, and a realization that the microbiome, the community of bacteria within us, is actually really an essential part of who we are, what mates we choose, what diseases we're susceptible to, and these type of things. So I think it's an area of discovery at the moment, which is really nice to keep an eye on.
Fantastic. And just I won't keep you for much longer, Charlie, I promise, but we'll let you escape in a minute. But I just think, just for completeness sake, I'd really like to touch on now as well yet another thing which I know your group focuses on. Again, we've already touched on this, but social living in cooperation and complex societies. And again, I think this is yet again something that listeners can think about just in everyday lives, right? I mean, they can think about why we live in such cooperative societies, or maybe they'll look at, I don't know, bees or something and wonder, okay, what makes them different to something that lives in a solitary way. And I think that's yet again this kind of transition, because I guess in all of this it's quite difficult, I know it is for me personally, to approach things with a kind of really neutral view in terms of, there's nothing special about us as humans. I think that's quite a difficult thing to establish first, right, before you then think about the benefits of group living and all of this kind of thing, because we're approaching this from the point of view, well, we have music, we have art, we have culture, we have science. Mm-hmm. All of these things are very specific, but there's nothing special about us as humans. I know I'm sounding a bit crazy probably now. But I just think, again, this is something else which listeners can think about, I think, the group living side to things. I don't know if you could kind of, chat a little bit about that for us as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I find it really interesting and rewarding to think about how our societies work in the context of other organisms. And some parts of our lives are very unique and special, and other parts that can be understood by general evolutionary principles. And I think that's teasing those two things apart is fascinating. I think there is also a danger there of that we try and extrapolate how we operate to other animals, and what we learn from other animals we then try and extrapolate to how humans work. So I would say there's maybe a little bit or reason to be a little bit cautious there as well, but it is, I think, like you mentioned honeybees, to see how species have evolved to organise themselves to overcome particular, say, problems or propagate more successfully. And social insects in general, honeybees, ants, have this fascinating way of organising themselves. And I think it's important for us to see that we're not any more sophisticated than other species, but that there are different ways that organisations have evolved and what are the reasons behind that. I think is a
fantastic. Well, thanks very much, Charlie. And as promised, I think I will begin to let you go now. But one key thing, your song request.
Well, this is tough. So I'm living in Sweden. I have 2 kids, and they have a favourite song. I Am a Hunter by Atlantis. I think that all the listeners will hunt me down, and
then I can just run out the studio. Well, thanks very much, Charlie. Thanks again. And in terms of website links and things like this, Charlie, do you have them to hand, or I'll provide them with the interview, of course. But if there's anything, anywhere that you'd like listeners to go that you'd like to kind of say on air, then you're welcome to do that. In terms of Twitter, anything like that.
Yeah, I mean, we try and advertise the research that's going on in the group through a website, charliecornwallis.org, and also have a Twitter account, it's just Charlie Cornwallis, and try and advertise the research that's going on and that's paid by very nice taxpayers. So it's always good to get the public's opinion on these things.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, Charlie. In that case, we'll let you go.
Thanks a lot. Cheers.
Thanks very much to Dr. Charlie Cornwallis of Lund University. Fantastic having you on, Charlie. Thank you. Now we have another scientist guest for you this evening, Professor Fiona Jordan from Bristol University. She's an anthropologist. But first, it's time to get a bit of a different song request now, because this is from Jamal Edwards, MBE. Now, I spoke to him very briefly, I just popped him on the show just to get a couple of song requests, basically. Hope that's all right. Just thought, let's spice up the playlist a little bit. Now, Jamal, well, he's a bit of an inspirational man. He actually became an entrepreneur at 15 years old when he founded SBTV. SBTV now is a very large channel, primarily a channel on YouTube, with thousands of subscribers, over 1 million now, I think, but actually credited with the discovery of artists such as Ed Sheeran before they achieved international success. So fantastic. So Jamal primarily began, I believe, in the area of grime music. Anyway, let's see what he's got to request for us. He's also got a little quick inspirational message for anybody out there listening who needs it today as well. So here he is, Jamal Edwards, MBE.
My name is Jamal Edwards. I started SBTV when I was about 15. The main reason I started it was because I felt the artist that I wanted to film wasn't being represented in the mainstream media. And years later down the line, I've filmed so many artists, from the Ed Sheerans to the Skeptors, to the Stromaes, and it's like all about now creating a platform for up-and-coming musicians to basically voice their thoughts, as well as like well-known stars as well. Obviously, I found my passion when I was about 15, but there's other people that find their passions when they're over 70 and their 40s and their 30s, and I thought that's quite important. It's never too late, or it's never too early to become an entrepreneur.
And Jamal, I wonder if we could kind of touch on what it was like when you first kicked off SBTV, because of course, people will be familiar with the fact, of course, that really we can thank you guys for discovering Ed Sheeran. I mean, Ed Sheeran, of course, was on SBTV before he he achieved worldwide fame and things, and it must have been quite an amazing thing to be a part of. Discovering all of these up and coming artists.
It was amazing, and it's about now trying to take it to the next level. I'm always having my music and my entry point into music, but it's allowed me to then, it's opened me up to a whole different world as well, which I'm very fortunate for.
And this might be quite difficult for a man such as yourself, of course, because you're very used to looking for new music and all this kind of thing. But I wonder if you have an obvious song request for today. I'd love to just play a song alongside your appearance today. This might be a bit of a hard question, as I said, because you're kind of a professional chooser of songs. so I don't know.
I've got two songs.
Go for it.
One is Dave Streatham, and the other one is Rosaria Malamente.
I feel a bit like we're kind of stealing your playlist here, Jamal. I hope you don't mind.
Yeah, no worries. One is in English and one isn't in English. I love to expand people's music horizons.
Thank you very much, Jamal.
Thank you for having me. Nice one.
So here we go. You're about to have your musical horizons expanded by Jamal Edwards.
Coast FM.
Now I am going to begin
to say goodbye, because I'm going to leave you with our last very, very special guest indeed. I'm going to leave you in the very, very capable hands of Professor Fiona Jordan. To close up the show tonight, it is an anthropologist. Fiona is interested in the evolution of language, and specifically today she's going to be talking about the evolution of human kinship systems. So that's fantastic. So thank you very much, Fiona. And thank you indeed to all of my very, very special guests for today. Thank you to Professor Deborah Gordon from Stanford University, who we had on first this evening, talking about the Ants in Space project, the coolest sounding project in the world, where ants went to the International Space Station. If you missed that, catch this again on the catch up on my Facebook page. Find me, Ben the Radio Guy. Do it. Hear about the Antonet as well, robotics, and also just the one thing that she had a problem with in Ant-Man, Marvel Ant-Man. She had just one problem. Anyway, I'm sure you caught that. Anyway, thank you very much to Deborah there. Thank you to Dr. Charlie Cornwallis from Lund University in Sweden, talking about some of the major evolutionary transitions that have helped shape life on Earth. We heard very briefly from Libby Jackson as well, who has been on a previous show. She is Tim Peake's Principia Mission Outreach Manager and a Human Spaceflight Director. So we heard very, very briefly from Libby today. Thanks again, Libby. Thanks to Jamal Edwards, MBE, who the founder of SBTV music site. Thank you very much, Jamal, and thank you to Dee Kafari, MBE, best known, of course, for setting that record for becoming the first woman to sail solo, non-stop around the world in both directions. Thanks very much, Dee. Now then, it's about time we got Professor Fiona Jordan onto the show, isn't it? Now, of course, the first obvious question you might be wondering, and don't worry because I wondered this as well, is what is anthropology? All right, well, let's get her to explain that. Then we'll get chatting.
Anthropology is one of those subjects where you say to people, I'm an anthropologist, and they say, do you work with chimpanzees? Or do you do Indiana Jones, Lara Croft archaeology? And I personally don't do those things, but they are part of the field of anthropology. So, very broadly, anthropology is the study of human beings, the study of human culture, our story of our species as a biological phenomena, the story of cultural diversity, understanding ourselves and what it kind of means to be human. And many other disciplines lay claim to that, but I guess some of the things that set anthropology out as being different are an emphasis on comparativeness, an emphasis on the universals of our species, also the differences, and an emphasis on things like fieldwork as a way of gathering data.
I really wanted to get onto a topic which I know you're going to be speaking about this today as well, but the Makin project, because of course I think the thing which might occur to someone straight away listening to this is it sounds incredibly complicated because there's an awful lot of different types of data that I'm sure you can work with. And I know this project that you're going ahead with and you're going to be talking about today involves a bunch of different types of data. I wonder if you could kind of outline that for us.
Yeah, sure. So the Makin project is a project that at its heart is trying to understand something very fundamental about being human, which is kinship, so family, marriage, how we organise relatedness to other people. And unlike other species, we have a variety of different ways of organising our families, of our norms around marriage, our norms around the kinds of family members that we live with, the kinds of childcare that we have, inheritance patterns, all those things come under this umbrella of kinship. And kinship has been at the heart of anthropology for most of its existence. So anthropology kind of started, if you like, by early anthropologists noting that there were great differences between human societies and how many spouses one could have at any one time, for example, or the ways in which people treated their cousins versus their siblings. So some of these questions are very enduring, particularly because for anthropologists, family is often the kind of core unit of social structure for different societies. At the base of many traditional hunter-gatherer populations, for example, family is very important. Family is very important in all kinds of societies, even our own, but the ways in which that plays out varies. So for myself, I come from a very cross-disciplinary background. So I started off with an undergraduate degree in psychology. I got interested in anthropology and biology and switched to biological anthropology as well. And then I ended up actually being very interested in language and linguistics as a kind of a tool to understand the past as well. So this project has brought together those different fields from anthropology, from evolutionary theory and methods, from linguistics and from psychology. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to understand. We've got all of this diversity across the planet. There's something like 7,000 languages that are spoken. We have ethnographic records from thousands of societies, and yet we find these clusters of patterns of how we organise families. Anywhere between sort of 6 to 12 kind of main categories of family structure. So our just very simple question is, why do we see that diversity, and why don't we see all of the other millions of possibilities that we potentially could have? So we're taking 3 approaches, and the first is an evolutionary approach, a cultural evolutionary approach, where we take some of the methods that evolutionary biologists use to understand how species are related. So if you're a biologist and you want to know, perhaps you discover a new species and you want to know, is it related to other species that we know about, you can sequence its DNA, and then you can use statistical programs to see how similar that species is to other species, and then you can look at some of its behaviours. So if it's a bird, is it a songbird, for example, and does that songbird have particular kinds of territorial singing that it shares with other species in the same kind of group? So there are a whole range of really powerful statistical methods that we can use on human societies and human languages. So we can say, if we build a family tree of human languages, and then we look at those societies in that context of some being more closely related than others, does that help us explain the variation that we see in family systems? So our 2 Polynesian societies, for example, who share fairly similar languages, do they also share fairly similar family structures? So that's kind of at the heart of what we're doing in that project. We're creating a massive database, so everyone's into big data these days. I don't really think that what we're doing can be claimed to be big data, but we're building something called KinBank, and this is a database of kinship language, so the words that we have for different members of family. At the moment we've got something like 850 different languages from all across the world. I think we've got around 13 different major language families, and we've got just over 100 different kinds of relatives that we're trying to collect the words for. And we're matching that up to other databases that I've been involved in that have information on things like marriage, inheritance, descent, but also the ways people have of making a living. Are they hunter-gatherers? Do they do agriculture? Also the environmental characteristics of where that society might be. So the big questions that we're asking in that project are, can we infer what went on in the past? Can we do some ancestral reconstruction, a kind of virtual archaeology? It's very hard to infer what kinds of marriage systems people might have had in the past. There's not much you can dig up as an archaeologist, but with these methods we can project back in time using statistical tools. And we're also asking whether there are what biologists call coevolutionary patterns. So if you have a particular kind of kinship system, is that co-evolving together with a particular marriage system or way of making a living, for example, and we're able to use these statistical methods to test those hypotheses. So that's our evolution sub-project. We're also just interested in how people talk about their family in everyday life. So we have another project where we are looking at kinship language usage. So across over 20 Indo-European languages. So these are languages spoken across Europe and parts of India and South Asia. We have gathered something like 90 million words of everyday language, of people talking that's been transcribed, of the language that is used in newspapers and other forms of media, of internet language. So we have things like memes and bulletin boards, forum conversations, all sorts of kind of just boring everyday human language. And in it we're looking to see how often people talk about their relatives and whether there are patterns that are comparable across languages, that we know the relationship relationships between. So that is part of trying to understand the kind of everyday mechanisms, if you like, of the ways in which different kinds of relatives may or may not be important to us, because we really don't know. Do we talk about our relatives that much? Do we use the word uncle? And do I, as an English speaker, use the word uncle more than a French speaker might use their term for uncle? So those are the kinds of questions we're looking at in that project. And then lastly, and perhaps most kind of in a more novel sense, we're trying to understand how children acquire language and knowledge about family. And this is something that, sort of going back to having done psychology in the past, really fascinates me, that psychologists have kind of ignored this cognitive skill, if you like. So psychologists know a lot about how children acquire numerical reasoning, for example, or how they learn theory of mind, that other people can think thoughts and have feelings. But the quite complex understanding that, for example, a grandmother is a mother's mother, or an uncle is both a mother's brother or a father's brother, or even other kinds of relatives, that's really tricky, and yet we expect children to acquire this knowledge quite early on. And obviously in English we have a particular kind of kinship system, but in other languages there will be different kinship systems. So one of our aims was to do some field work in a language other than English, where we could think about the kinds of ways in which just everyday interactions might be going on, where children are learning the distinctions between a cousin and a brother, for example. Are children being taught kinship at home? We don't know. There's very, very little research on that. And we wanted to be able to think about some, because working with children is very difficult, we wanted to be able to think about ways of eliciting this knowledge from children in different ways. So my colleague Dr. Alice Mitchell has been working with the Datoga population in Tanzania. So these are folk who live a pastoralist lifestyle, so they rely on animal herding, fairly small scale communities. Children don't necessarily partake in kind of formal education or schooling. And the kinship system there is quite different to what we have in English. So families can be polygynous, so men can have more than one wife, and residence is what we call patrilocal. So women, when they marry, go to live in a different community than the one that they were brought up in. And so the ways in which kids might pick up the kinship system there, and the different labels for kin, have been part of our investigations. And we had to do things like come up with sets of dolls for kids to use, and various kinds of ways to elicit their knowledge using photos and asking them to kind of give us a list of people and families. And the idea there is that we'll be comparing that to a similar investigation with English-speaking kids in Bristol, where I work, and trying to see whether there are commonalities in whether children are being taught, but also the kinds of stages of acquisition about knowledge about family. So that's all our data, and that's the kind of ways of working in the project.
Oh, fantastic! Well, that last project you're talking about, involving looking at children, how they're acquiring these new, the kinship systems. How I think that's kind of immediate and obvious importance to people listening, because of course, the children are of course the next generation, aren't they? So you're looking directly at what the next generation is picking up, and I also wonder whether it might have implications and be really interesting to people interested as well in kind of mental disorders.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So I mentioned that psychologists have been really interested in different domains of knowledge that children acquire, and for example our social cognition is one thing that psychologists are interested in, this idea of kind of knowledge about other people and how they might behave. And I think that it's pretty well established that this idea of theory of mind, for example, knowing that not only do other people have thoughts and feelings, but they might have thoughts and feelings about other people as well, is something that it takes a while to develop in children, and that if it doesn't, that can be an indication of developmental disorders, for example. So it might be that our work on kind of establishing the trajectory for kinship knowledge to emerge or to be acquired. Obviously it's culturally specific, so there has to be some kind of form of acquisition. But whether, at certain points, if children or teens haven't quite acquired that knowledge, whether that's an indication of difficulties with social cognition, kind of more in general. It's definitely the case that what we've found so far is that it's actually really hard, and even English-speaking kids with our what is actually quite a simple kinship system, it takes until early adolescence before people are able to use kinship language effectively. So, for example, if I ask you the question, Bob is your uncle, what does Bob call you?
Exactly. It's even.
It takes a while
exactly.
for you to think, oh, she wants nephew from me, and that kind of reciprocal understanding of how you sit in a kinship system. It's actually a bit of algebra, I think.
Sure.
It's really quite complex. So I do think that there are aspects to kinship language that potentially could be used as perhaps not single diagnostic tools, but definitely kind of evidence of whether there's any developmental issues going on for kids.
I think one thing that, related to something you've just said there, but I think one thing that obviously a lot of people are really interested in is kind of trying to, and I don't know whether we can go into any kind of depth at all here, and not a problem at all if we can't, but I'm just thinking about, an awful lot of people being interested in kind of reasons behind the kind of high intelligence of humans. And of course, one of the things which people often bring in there is these kind of really complex social environments that we have to adapt to. And that's a perfect example of that, I think. You saying that these children have to learn these really complicated, the correct terms, the correct ways to behave in these different circumstances because of these really complicated kinship systems. To me, I don't know whether that's one of these factors that really plays in there, those complex social environments.
Yeah, it's a really nice point, Ben. I think that we've got a range of explanations on the table for why we humans are so exceptional in many ways, and the history of anthropology and archaeology has taught us that we go through these stages of thinking it's all about tool use, or we think it's all about kind of political maneuvering, or we think it's all about language or various other things. And I think the kind of social brain hypothesis, which it's been called, definitely has some legs to it. But I think that this aspect of kinship and family has potentially been kind of neglected from those kinds of considerations. This diversity that we see cross-culturally in terms of everybody has a system of language for labelling who is kin and who is not kin. Every language that we have discovered has some kind of way of labelling that this person either has a kinship role or they don't. So we have this very kind of ancient human language technology for demarcating out the social world, and it varies, and it must vary in ways that are useful to us, are adaptive for our social environment, and acquiring that is really important. If you go around calling the wrong person mummy, that has some consequences. And so it is important that to socialise children, into their social groups, that is part of it. And I think the complexity of that acquisition process has really been kind of ignored, and what we're hoping that our project is going to do is to provide some tools for other researchers to take to different communities around the world to do similar kinds of investigations, and then perhaps in the future we'll arrive at some sort of more global understanding of whether there are similarities in the ways that we are socialising children in this way.
Fantastic. 'Cause, I suppose to any kind of budding biologists out there, obviously recognising your kin is absolutely essential, isn't it? In fact, it's basic hallmark of kin selection, things like this. It's essential that that you can recognise kin from kin and correctly refer to them in that way, I suppose, as well. So it's really essential, of central importance, isn't it?
Yeah, and as humans, we don't have some of the tools that other species have available to them. We don't recognise one another by scent. At least that's not our primary way of recognising one another. It seems like there might be ways in which we can detect resemblance in faces. There is some research going on by Lisa De Bruin and her colleagues at Glasgow at the moment, looking at those sorts of questions. but language is the primary tool by which we label people as kin and non-kin. And it's absolutely critical, knowing who potentially might care for you or who you have to care for, who you owe some responsibility to, who you might inherit things from, who you should cooperate with, who you ought not to cooperate with. A simple kinship term will do a hell of a lot of work for you, just by giving you that information, in a nice, neat package.
And Fiona, I really like if it's okay with you to kind of step. I won't keep you for too much longer, honestly. But I just really like to kind of step back in time again for a moment now, because you were talking about this at the beginning. But I just really like for our listeners to kind of think about this a bit more closely, and that is, and I don't know. Again, I don't know how much we can think about today on this, but you're kind of. And with the Very Kin project, you're kind of, one of the central questions, understanding that kind of diversity and where it's come from. And can you think back to, and is it possible to think back all the way to, with research like this, to think back all the way to kind of the origin of language and where it came from originally? Probably not really possible. But
it's a tough one, and I don't think I'm prepared to nail my colours to any particular mast on that.
Sure.
What we can do is the approach that we're taking is looking at a number of very large language families around the world, and being able to project back on the order of thousands of years, in some cases something like 7,000 or 8,000 years. From those, we can say, well, perhaps there have been a set of processes, perhaps associated with the development of agriculture, for example, or urbanization and kind of population density. Maybe there are processes that have gone on in prehistory that we might be able to characterize. We might be able to say, it looks like most of the kinship systems in the past were this kind, and then there's been a change towards this kind. So we'll be able to say things like that. Bridging that gap between what we can observe about primate social systems, what we can glean from the archaeological records in the middle, and then what we can do with the tools that we're using. We've got quite a gap, and it's more than 1 million years there. I don't necessarily think that the work that we're doing will be able to bridge that gap, but we will be able to push back from the ethnographic data that we have now, I think with some really useful inferences about what's gone on in the past. But as to saying this was the original form of the human family, you can imagine my air quotes around that. I really don't know that we'll be able to do that. And I, at the heart, am a variationist. I strongly believe that the most singular aspect to human behaviour is our adaptability and our variation. And I imagine that there's been variation built into that flexibility from the start. As soon as we started trying to colonise this planet, I think that we've had to be flexible in how we organise our family lives.
As a last question, I don't know whether you'd be okay with this, but I'd really like to just talk about your kind of reasons for going into this field in the first place a little bit, if you don't mind.
Yeah,
particularly interesting, I suppose, for any students out there who might tune into this. I think it'd be really interesting to hear, how someone such as yourself came into being in this field.
Yeah. So if I can take this field to be sort of cultural evolution, as I described, I have a very multidisciplinary background that included anthropology, psychology and biology along the way. I was, I guess, lucky enough to be mentored by a couple of people who themselves were very interdisciplinary. So my master's supervisor, Russell Gray, straddled behavioural biology and psychology. My PhD supervisor started off as a bird biologist and moved into human behavioural ecology. So I had great role models there in not having to think of myself in any particular silo for research. And at the time that I was doing my PhD, especially, people were more and more beginning to apply evolutionary theory and methods to human behaviour and to cultural evolution. So that was kind of in the atmosphere at the time to think about those kinds of questions. In terms of kinship, when I was writing my PhD, I was reading fairly widely about cultural variation, and postmarital residence, which is a very technical anthropological term, but it just basically means who you live with after you get married. So do you set up a new form of residence like people in Western societies do, or do you go and live with your husband's family? Do you go and live with your wife's family? There's great form of variation, and it seemed to me something that could be tied to understanding the transmission of resources across generations, and I was interested at that at the time. And that just led to a whole range of reading around kinship, around family organisation. I then, after I finished my PhD, I had the opportunity to work at a Max Planck Institute for psycholinguistics, and that got me interested in the language variation around kinship, and I suppose that's the point at which all of these ideas started to come together, and I thought it was a lovely kind of nexus of the evolutionary biology, the language and the culture kind of all coming together. And I've not necessarily been interested in sort of kinship and family for my entire career, but it's sparked some really interesting conversations. I'm now a bit of a hobby genealogist about my own family. That was something that never interested me before. And my favourite question to sort of ask people at cocktail parties, not that I go to many cocktail parties, but at parties, is around conversations about who gets to be called granny and who gets to be called nana when anybody has a new baby. The kind of naming of grandparents.
And everyone cares about that a lot.
It's very, very important, and it's a really interesting kind of way in which people can connect this quite abstract idea of kinship language to something that they experience kind of in their own lives, and those negotiations about names for grandparents seem to be a nice point of conversation for people.
Well, thanks very much, Fiona. I do appreciate your time today. And this is the last thing for you now, and I'd love to give you a little song choice, actually. I know this is not very fair because I've just sprung this on you, but this is my favourite question because it's a bit harsh, isn't it? But if you've got an obvious song that I can choose for you.
Right.
And we're going to make it your kind of theme tune for the show, you see.
That's fine. Well, how about this? So I'm very interested in human variation, and I see it as kind of like the core mission for cultural evolution is to really explain variation. But the flip side are universals. What do we as humans all kind of share in common? I'm also a massive Blur fan, so you have to have the Universal by Blur.
Fantastic, perfect. Oh, great choice. Well, thanks, Fiona. Thanks again.